two men were already serving prison sentences for rape when they stood trial over what Louise Nicholas said they had done to her years earlier. The jury was never told about those convictions. It cleared both men and the senior police officer standing beside them. Nobody went to prison for what Louise says happened to her. But somebody did go to prison for making sure her complaint never had a fair chance. This is the story of how one teenage girl's allegation exposed something far bigger than three officers and forced New Zealand police to change the way it investigated its own. Louise Nicholas was 13 years old. Before this story became about police trials and commissions, it was about a 13-year-old girl asking to be believed. A Aotearoa schoolgirl who should have been worrying about friends and growing up, not about whether anyone would believe her. She says that's when it started. Repeated rape and sexual assault by serving police officers in her hometown of Aotearoa. She named three of them: Brad Shipton, Bob Scollum, and Clint Rickards. And she reported it, not years later, to a detective at the time, whose entire job was to take a complaint like hers seriously and build a case out of it. His name was John Dewar. Dewar did not simply fail to build her case. The way he handled it became one of the reasons the case repeatedly collapsed, and years later landed him in the dock. In 1993, while he was investigating a separate officer over a different allegation from Louise, Dewar sat her down for an interview of his own accord. What came out of that room was a signed statement saying the sexual activity with Shipton, Scollum, and Rickards had been consensual. Louise has since said she signed it to help Dewar out. He was under pressure after the first mistrial, and she didn't write the words herself. Whatever the reason behind it, that single document did more damage to her case than anything the defence ever managed. It gutted her credibility in the room. The officer investigating the complaint had, in effect, produced the evidence that would go on to sink it. That statement would follow Louise into court. Years later, it would also become part of the case against Dewar himself. In the early 1990s, her allegations finally made it to court. Twice. Both times the trial collapsed into a mistrial, and both collapses traced back to the same cause. Dewar introduced hearsay evidence that should never have been allowed anywhere near a jury. Hearsay. Testimony about what someone else supposedly said, rather than what a witness actually saw or heard. Can't be properly tested or cross-examined, which is why courts are very wary of it. A prosecution case doesn't need many cracks to fall apart. It needs one in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Dewar put hearsay in front of a jury anyway. Twice. It sank the first trial, then it sank the second. The same flaw repeated, as if nobody in the room had learned anything from the first collapse. A separate officer tried over her allegations was acquitted in 1994. And then the case simply stopped. No conviction, no third attempt, no resolution of any kind. Louise kept living in the same region as the men she says had assaulted her. Dewar kept his badge. After the case collapsed, a senior officer, Detective Chief Inspector Rex Miller, was brought in to review how Dewar had handled it. What he found was blunt. Dewar's own written reports on the three officers never mentioned the sexual misconduct allegations at all. Not downplayed, not buried in a footnote. Left out entirely. And still, nothing happened to him. Not yet anyway. For close to a decade, the case disappeared from public view. Louise kept living with what she had said had happened, while the official process offered her no resolution. Philip Kitchen's interest in this case didn't begin when the story finally broke. It began nearly a decade before that, in the mid-1990s, working as a journalist for the Dominion. He picked up a tip-off about how Dewar had handled the case. For years, all he had to go on were fragments, rumours, a name, a case file that had quietly gone nowhere. He kept chasing it long after any sane person would have given up. Kitchen wasn't writing a retrospective for a slow news week. He was investigating, following leads that a compromised process had never followed properly the first time. His reporting did something a decade of official silence hadn't. It made the story impossible to bury a second time. In 2004, working alongside TVNZ, Kitchen and the Dominion Post published what he'd spent years building. And for the first time, Louise's name and allegations were public. That decision set off two separate processes at once. One, a full reinvestigation, codenamed Operation Austin. Two, a government-ordered commission of inquiry into how New Zealand police, as an institution, handled sexual assault complaints. Not just Louise's case, every case like it. Before we get into what Operation Austin actually found, keep this in mind. By 2004, this was no longer just Louise's case. It was becoming a test of what New Zealand police were willing to confront about themselves. The officer running Operation Austin, Detective Superintendent Nick Perry, later described Shipton and the group of officers around him in very blunt terms. Predatory, deliberately targeting vulnerable women, sometimes operating as a pack. That's not colourful language from a true crime script. That's the man who ran the investigation on the record. Operation Austin began with a small group of investigators in early 2004 and more than doubled in size as further allegations emerged. Investigators eventually linked close to a dozen women to allegations involving the same core group of officers. Across the wider operation, they examined detailed complaints from 25 victims. What began with one woman reopening a case the system had failed to resolve had become an investigation into a much broader pattern. Here's what actually separated Operation Austin from every failed attempt before it. This time, every complainant got a dedicated liaison officer and support through Victim Support New Zealand built into the investigation from day one, not bolted on afterward. Now that sounds procedural, but it wasn't. The independent authority that later reviewed the operation's conduct called the victim management approach groundbreaking and recommended it become the standard for how police handle cases like this one going forward. Think about what that means. It took a complaint from a 13-year-old, buried for the better part of 2 decades, to force the people investigating rape allegations against their own colleagues to figure out how to treat a victim properly. That shouldn't have needed inventing. It should have already existed. One of those women became the complainant in a second, separate case. 16 years old at the time of her alleged assault in the early 1980s. Her identity is permanently suppressed by the court, and it stays that way here too. A dozen women at minimum, tied to one group of officers. 25 once you count everyone Operation Austin took seriously enough to investigate in full. One district's police force. Meanwhile, Rickards wasn't sitting quietly through any of this. While Operation was still running, he laid 14 separate complaints against the way it was being conducted, alleging bias against him. The Police Complaints Authority under Judge Boren at the time examined every one of them and found not one justified. That didn't stop him. After his eventual acquittal, Rickards would call the entire operation a shambles, one he said he'd have been embarrassed to lead himself. The man under investigation was actively trying to discredit the investigation. And when his own trial finally opened in 2006, he walked into court wearing his police uniform, against the regulations that apply to a suspended officer. Whatever the jury was going to decide, he wanted the room to see his rank first. Before we go any further, try and keep the dates and cases separate. The next stretch moves through 3 trials in 3 years. Mount Maunganui in 2005, Louise's Rotorua case in 2006, and a second Rotorua woman's case in 2007. Some of the accused overlap. The cases, evidence, and verdicts do not. In 1989, a 20-year-old woman was lured to a life-saving hut at Mount Maunganui under the pretense of a date. She was bound and raped by multiple men. It took 16 years for that case to reach a verdict. In 2005, Brad Shipton and Bob Scollum, with a third man, were finally convicted. Scollum received 8 years, Shipton received 8.5. Those are the convictions from the cold open. Hold on to that fact because it's about to matter more than it should have been allowed to. While Shipton and Scollum were already behind bars for those convictions, they, along with Rickards, stood trial over what Louise said had happened to her in the 1980s. On the 31st of March 2006, the jury cleared all three. The jury reaching that verdict had no idea that 2 of the 3 men in the dock were, at that exact moment, serving prison sentences for a different rape. The judge kept that fact from the courtroom, so it could not influence the jury either way. A legally sound decision, and one that meant the jury made its call without knowing something you now know. 2 men already convicted of rape, and the jury was not allowed to know. Less than 1 year later, the same 3 men stood trial again. This time over a second Rotorua woman's allegations. Kidnapping, indecent assault, February 2007. Again, the verdicts were not guilty. Nothing Rickards, Shipton or Scollum was convicted of related to either Rotorua complainant. 2 women, 2 juries, the same 3 names walking out both times. If the 3 men she named walked both times, who actually paid? John Dewar, the detective who took her original complaint, introduced the hearsay that sank 2 trials and obtained the signed statement that damaged her case. In 2007, Dewar was convicted on 4 counts of attempting to obstruct or defeat the course of justice for covering up her allegations against Rickards, Shipton and Scollum. 4.5 years in prison. The men she named walked free. The detective responsible for investigating her complaint went to prison for obstructing it. Clint Rickards never had a criminal conviction against his name over any of this. Twice cleared, by the letter of the law, an innocent man. By this point, he wasn't just any officer, he was an assistant police commissioner. One of the most senior officers in this country. But even a clean legal record couldn't save him. Advocacy groups organised protests specifically demanding his removal, arguing that a man this senior staying in his post, regardless of what any jury decided, was in its own kind of institutional failure. In November 2007, Rickards resigned. Police paid out the rest of his contract on his way out the door. Roughly 13 months' salary, about $300K, as part of the settlement that got him gone. He left without a criminal conviction attached to this case, but by then, the damage was bigger than any verdict. Police were paying to end a public confidence problem they could no longer carry. The court cases ended without the verdict Louise had sought, but the wider consequences of her decision to speak publicly were only beginning. The Commission of Inquiry into Police Conduct, established in 2004 and led by Dame Margaret Basley, wasn't a quick review. It ran for 3 years and it went looking for every complaint like Louise's buried anywhere in the system. The Commission examined 313. That's right, 313 historical complaints of sexual assault involving more than 200 police officers. The overwhelming majority had never been properly investigated. What the Commission found underneath those numbers was a culture, not just a failure. Tight male bonding inside the force and a tolerance for misconduct that let officers protect each other before they protected the people making complaints. Dame Margaret Basley said the evidence appeared strong enough to justify in further investigation into 141 of those complaints. This was not evidence of one isolated failure. It was evidence of a system that had repeatedly failed to investigate allegations made against its own officers. When the report landed in 2007, it carried 60 recommendations, 47 of them aimed directly at police. And they weren't vague gestures toward doing better. They targeted specific structural failure points. How sexual assault complaints get investigated in the first place. How a complaint against a serving officer gets handled when the person receiving it wears the same uniform as the person it's about. How discipline actually functions, top to bottom, when the accused and the investigator answer to the same chain of command. How ethics and conduct get taught and enforced, not just written down in a manual nobody ever reads. The recommendations went directly to the weaknesses exposed by Louise's case. Police investigating police, poor supervision, weak accountability, and a complaint process that could be compromised by the very people entrusted to run it. The Commission was not simply documenting one failed investigation. It was redesigning the system that allowed that failure to continue unchecked. Police accepted every one of the 60 recommendations, publicly apologised to the woman the system had failed, and committed to a decade-long program of change. Monitored year over year by the Auditor General so the promise couldn't quietly disappear once the headlines moved on. That monitoring ran up until 2017. Even years after that, follow-up reviews kept landing on the same conclusion. Real progress but slow. And some recommendations still unfinished more than a decade on. 15 years after Baisley's report, police were still publishing updates against it. The reforms lasted far beyond the headlines. And they began because a complaint made by a 13-year-old had been mishandled, weakened and left unresolved. But she refused to let it disappear. Shipton and Scollin were both paroled in 2008, having served roughly a third of their Mount Maunganui sentences. In 2009, Shipton told a parole board his life had been full of what he called disgraceful behaviour, an admission tied specifically to the crime he was convicted of. He always denied Louise's allegations. He died in 2024 in a care home after years with early onset dementia. Dewar served his sentence and largely disappeared from public life. Ricketts has never been convicted of anything connected to this case, and has maintained his innocence publicly more than once. He finished a law degree during his suspension and was admitted to the bar in 2008, and was reported to be weighing legal action of his own against Louise over what he considered perjury on the stand. Nothing came of it. Louise, meanwhile, ended up on the other side of the system that failed her. She now works as an advisor to the same police force she once accused, helping shape how officers are trained to handle complaints like the one nobody handled properly for her. Louise never got the verdict she sought, but she never stopped speaking, and that is why any of the wider consequences followed. The men Louise accused were acquitted, and those verdicts must be respected. But the system that handled her complaint did not escape judgment. John Dewar was imprisoned for attempting to obstruct or defeat the cause of justice. An assistant police commissioner resigned after public confidence collapsed. A national inquiry uncovered 330 historical complaints, issued 60 recommendations, and triggered a decade of independent monitoring. Her persistence forced New Zealand police to confront failures that reached far beyond one detective, one district, or one moment in time. This story is remembered not because the system worked, but because Louise refused to stop asking it to. Her determination did not secure the verdict she wanted. It changed the way an entire country examined its police. Before I ask what you think, remember this. The most important person in this story was never the detective, the commissioners, or the officers. It was always and will always be Louise Nicholas. Does a case like this tell you the evidence genuinely wasn't there, or that the system was never built to convict its own in the first place? Drop it in the comments. Whether you agree or disagree, I read every one. Whatever happened inside those rooms nearly 40 years ago may never be proven in a criminal court. But what happened after Louise walked into a police station is now part of New Zealand history. Until then, I'm Anthony. Thanks for joining me. Stay safe and stay out of the static.